Thank you very much for sitting with us
for
this interview. You've probably heard today's news that allegedly a group of Iranians have hacked into the personal information of American officials,
right,
aside from officials from some other countries, among them some congressmen.
Right.
Do you believe that you might be one of those congressmen targeted?
Well, I have no way of knowing. I did see the New York Times piece, and obviously it's a cause of pretty serious concern. Obviously, anytime there's any cyber attack or anything of that nature, it's a problem, and obviously it's something that the government is going to have to take a look at. I have no way of knowing at this point in time whether I've been targeted, although obviously I've been engaged in some issues that are critical to the relationship between Iran and the United States, so it's a possibility.
I understand. Can you probably mention some of those instances that you are engaged in with regards to the U.S. and Iran?
Well, I think because of the fact that my constituent, Amir Hekmati, is one of the Americans being held, I have, regular discussions with my staff and with others about his condition. I have to say that I'm not particularly concerned about the subject matter because we're quite transparent in all of our discussions. Our efforts have been pretty clear, and all of our work has been pretty much focused on the same thing. What do we need to do in order to make sure that Iran understands that an important prerequisite to Iran's re-entry as a member of the global community would be the release of Mr. Hekmati. So while I have said that in many, many private conversations, I say the same thing when I'm speaking publicly about the subject. So in that case, I'm not particularly concerned.
Speaking of Amir Hekmati, for whom you have been the front advocate for his release from Iran, Amir has been charged with spying for the United States.
Right.
There are two other Americans, one Robert Levinson, whom at the beginning we heard that he went to Iran for business purposes.
Right.
Recently, it was disclosed that he was a spy for the CIA, I believe.
Right.
And then recently, we've had the Snowden case, and just 2 days ago, first he was just considered a hacker, and then he said that he was a spy for the United States government. How confident are you that Amir is not a spy? Have you been in touch with the intelligence community here in the U.S., and you've been convinced that Amir is innocent and was just on a personal visit?
Well, in all the discussions that I've had with Amir's family, with officials of the government, I've never heard any information or any evidence, never seen any evidence actually even in the context of his trials in Iran that would indicate that he was anything other than a young man who went to Iran to visit his family. He traveled under his own name. He was transparent about his biography. The fact that he served as a member of the United States Marine Corps, while relevant to Iran, apparently, in the way they perceive his status, he was transparent even about that fact when he traveled to Iran. So I've seen nothing that would indicate that he was anything other than a young man who, after serving the United States in the military, had never been to Iran, wanted to meet the grandmother that he had never met, and after just a couple of weeks there was apprehended. So there's nothing that I've seen that would indicate it was anything other than that.
Congressman, would you be willing and would you propose that the United States offer something in return for Amir's release from Iran?
Well, first of all, I would leave the negotiation or any discussion over Mr. Hekmati's situation to the State Department and to the White House. I will say this. Amir has made it clear that he's innocent, and I believe him, and as we said, I have no reason to doubt anything that he has said in that regard. So I don't think there should be a prerequisite that there be an exchange or anything like that. But obviously the most important thing is that we get Amir Hekmati home. If it's in the intention of the United States at some point in time to release some individuals that may be under U.S. custody, I understand that that may take place, but I don't think that it should be a precondition or a prerequisite that Mr. Hekmati be released in exchange for another individual. I just don't think that the case warrants that kind of attention or that kind of a transaction.
I understand that Amir's case has been brought up, especially more often recently during the P5+1 talks with Iran.
Right.
What kind of reaction has the Iranian side shown once the American delegation speaks of Amir? Are they open to discussion about Amir's case?
Well, I wouldn't want to characterize the discussions that I'm aware of out of context, because I have not been a party to those conversations, other than to say that there has certainly been a willingness, not as a part of the P5+1 discussions, but as sort of a sidebar to those, there has been a willingness to discuss Mr. Hekmati's case, which is a big step forward. Obviously, after the election of President Rouhani, things have changed. And in fact, President Obama himself had a telephone conversation with President Rouhani when President Rouhani was in New York for the UN General Assembly. And the Hekmati case was discussed then. So my presumption is, and I've heard nothing that contradicts this, that there's a willingness to have a discussion about his case. Whether or not that means that there's productive negotiation going on or not, I'm really not in a position to comment.
And on the nuclear issue itself, today Gary Seymour is saying that the talks may be extended into the second 6-month period. A DOD official has also apparently said the same thing. A few weeks ago, I spoke with Congressman Price. He was basically saying the same thing, that at least the possible agreement might be considered after the U.S. midterm election, so that would be in the second 6-month period. Mm-hmm. What is your opinion? Do you think the talks are getting anywhere, and would it be a good thing for this deal to happen?
Well, I think it would be. Obviously, it's hard to prejudge what the deal would be until we know what the final larger agreement would look like. But it can't be seen as anything but progress. If the United States, even in the context of the P5+1, is engaged in discussion with Iran about reducing or eliminating nuclear capabilities for military purposes, it's a positive thing. It makes the world safer. So it would be my hope, and it was all of our intent, that when we entered into the interim agreement, that it would lead quickly to a permanent arrangement. If that's not the case, in the alternative, extending another short-term agreement in order to facilitate the development of a longer arrangement, while it's not preferable, it's certainly preferable to going back to the time before the negotiations began and to lose the opportunity to negotiate really what is essentially an important agreement for peace in the region.
So you're all for negotiations and for the agreement to happen. The National Defense Authorization Act for 2015, which was brought up just recently in the Congress and the House, I believe, it sets some preconditions for the final agreement. And the Obama administration has said that these preconditions are a deal breaker.
Right.
Definitely, Iran, as soon as they see it, they're going to say, no more talks, no, not a step further, let alone getting anywhere with the agreement. Are you for or against those preconditions?
Well, first of all, I did not vote for, I voted no on the Defense Authorization Act for a number of reasons, and included in those reasons, I think, was an overreach on the part of Congress in attempting to dictate important prerogatives that the administration, that the president has to have in order to do his job as commander-in-chief. I don't think it makes sense for Congress to try to limit the space available for these negotiations to take place. I think there are some who just don't believe that we ought to be negotiating anyway. It's a position that's, I think, untenable, unsupportable, and history would not treat those who fail to negotiate, or at least have the opportunity to negotiate for peace, well. But to my way of thinking, the president is right to engage Iran, through the P5+1 process. And we have to at least have some belief that it's possible that a negotiation can take place. But if the Congress decides that it's going to tie the hands of the administration and try to dictate to the President of the United States the kind of arrangement he can come up with, even if that arrangement makes us much safer, then I think Congress is clearly overreaching and overstepping its authority.
So you say a vote has been taken on that bill?
On the Defense Authorization Act.
Authorization Act.
Right.
So
it hasn't passed the Senate yet. It has passed the House, but it has not passed the Senate. Probably won't come up in the Senate for about 2 months.
So therefore, the preconditions are still in the bill?
They're in this House-passed bill, as far as I know.
Right.
But the Senate, my suspicion is that the Senate will deal with many of the strictures that the House Republicans insisted on in the Defense Authorization Act, including. The President has made it clear that if a bill comes to his desk that places undue limitations on his ability to try to negotiate for a more peaceful world, that he will veto that legislation. And I think that's the right position for him to take.
Congressman, let's look a little further ahead after the agreement. Iran basically came to the table for sanctions relief.
Right.
How fast could that relief be extended to them once everything's final?
Well, I think it needs to be incremental because, but it has to be tangible. It has to be real. You know, even in the period of the interim agreement, the U.S. executed additional sanction actions because of some activities that were taking place. So we've made it very clear that the relief that we're willing to provide is contingent on adherence to the agreement. So to me, I don't, again, want to prejudge or tie the hands of our negotiators. It would seem to me that there has to be some reasonable calibration that as Iran winds down its nuclear capabilities or adheres to whatever the agreement will be, that won't happen with a snap of a finger. There are capabilities that have to be addressed. Neither should the sanctions relief happen with the snap of a finger overnight. There has to be a period where there's a level of trust that is demonstrated, not just with words, not just by signing a sheet of paper, but by actually adhering to both the legal and the spirit of whatever agreement is written. The fact of the matter is it was the sanctions that brought Iran to the table in the first place. And so we have to be very careful about how we provide relief for those sanctions once the agreement, hopefully, is being implemented.
But in terms of process, it's going to be easy, although it's been signed into law. I just want to know how fast it could happen in terms of the process here in the United States.
In terms of sanction relief?
In terms of sanctions
relief. I think it should be calibrated to the implementation of the agreement in terms of Iran's nuclear capabilities, and I wouldn't want to prejudge what that agreement should look like, other than to say, I don't think anybody anticipates that the sanctions in their entirety would be lifted immediately upon the signature of an agreement. There will have to be some time.
Sure, but again, once Iran has satisfied the United States, could that a certain specific sanction that the U.S. has in mind for that time, for that act, could it be done overnight, or is that going to be a long, drawn process for a certain, for example, sanctions relief?
Well, I think a lot of it depends on what form the sanction might take. But if it has to do, for example, with the release of frozen assets, that can be a relatively quick process. But again, I don't want to try to predict or dictate what I think the timetable ought to look like. I think we should leave that to the negotiators.
Do you think resolving this issue with Iran could affect the entire, what happens in the entire Middle East region?
Oh, there's no question about that. I mean, we have a number of situations in the region that we have to address, and Iran is an important part of that region and has, unfortunately, in the not too recent past, contributed to some of the instability. The lack of any relationship between the United States and Iran for 35 years by itself has contributed to difficulties within the region. So I think it would make a difference, and I think it's one of the reasons that I support the negotiating process, not just to deal with the specific question of Iran's nuclear capabilities, but to leave open the opportunity that Iran has turned a page and can rejoin the global community and be a full participant in the global community. I mean, I meet many Iranian Americans, and I have a very good sense that the Iranian people have the same aspirations that any other people might have. There's been difficulties in government, for sure, but you know, the Iranian people, I'm sure, would like to join and fully participate in the global community. And I'm one that believes that all is possible. And while it might be difficult, and particularly dealing with the government of Iran has enormous challenges within it. What I've seen so far from President Rouhani is that we ought to give this an opportunity to work. We ought to give the negotiations the space and give peace a chance. Okay.
Congressman Kildee, thank you very much for speaking with Voice America-Persian Service.
Thank you very much.
Great, we covered a lot of topics.
Covered the territory, right?
Yes.